Welcome to the 2020 ACLS webinar series. The Association of Consultants for Liturgical Space is a voluntary membership organization of professionals dedicated to the creation of beautiful worship spaces for faith communities. This webinar series is part of our commitment to providing mutual professional support and continuing education for members. I'm Paul Barabo of Growth Design Group. I am the webinar facilitator for the ACLS Webinar Committee, and it's my pleasure to facilitate today's webinar. Our webinar topic today is entitled Where the Church Gathers, and our speakers are Ken Griesemer and Jim Hundt. Ken Griesemer, emeritus architect, has worked as a liturgical architect and design consultant since 1985. Based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Ken established his liturgical design consulting practice in 1999, serving church clients across the United States and in Mexico and New Zealand. He graduated from the University of Cincinnati College of Design, Architecture and Art in 1978 and completed studies at the Institute for Liturgical Consultants at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, Illinois in 1993. He is a founding member and past board president of the Association of Consultants for Liturgical Space. Since 2002, Ken has served as an associate board member of the Southwest Liturgical Conference. Jim Hundt is the owner of the Schenectady, New York firm of Foresight Architects, a firm with a special focus on religious architecture. Since founding his firm in 1993, he has designed a wide variety of buildings for over 100 religious organizations and other institutional clients throughout the eastern half of the country. Mr. Hundt graduated from the McGill University School of Architecture in Montreal in 1980. He is currently serving his second term as board president of the Association of Consultants for Liturgical Space and has previously served as vice chair of the Interfaith Forum on Religious Art and Architecture at the AIA, currently now Interfaith Design. Welcome to my colleagues at ACLS, both Ken Griesemer and Jim Hundt. It's a pleasure to have you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I just mentioned I was born in Schenectady, so it's really great to collaborate with Jim today. So our subject, Where the Church Gathers. Part one, I'm going to address under the heading of That Way We May Be One, a little bit of scriptural, theological, and liturgical foundations, talk a little bit about indoor and outdoor gathering, the notions of welcome, hospitality, and accessibility, and then look at some liturgical opportunities for both the outdoor gathering areas and the indoor gathering areas. Jim, in part two, under the heading, What Else Happens There, will share a little bit about first impressions, the role of first impressions, orientation, wayfinding, connections, and ministry outreach. So to start, this idea of the church gathering, for me, one of the best icons of the aspect of gathering is St. Peter's Square in Rome and the large colonnade that reaches out basically to embrace the entire world. And I love this sketch by Bernini from 1650 that basically shows Christ overlaid on the colonnade gathering the flock. Now, with this subject of gathering, I can't help but think about the fact that it's fairly symbolic that we're addressing this subject at a time when we've been separated and isolated, and just the very beginnings of starting to think about regathering as faith communities again. So it's been a pretty intense couple of months. So this is my new icon for St. Peter's, the empty St. Peter's Square, and Pope Francis walking all by himself on March 29th when he gave the blessing to the city and to the world. So what about scriptural foundations for this subject of gathering? Well, from the Gospel of John, we read that, "And I have given them the glory you gave me, so that they may be one, as we are one. I in them and you and me, that they may be brought to perfection as one. And in 1 Corinthians, for in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, slaves or free persons, and we were all given to drink of one Spirit. And then a paraphrase from Ephesians 1. With perfect wisdom and insight, God freely displayed the mystery of what was always intended, a plan for the fullness of time to unite the entire universe through Christ. And this idea of unity is something that we certainly, for Christians, is foundational in our baptism. And I love this image from the ceiling of the baptistry in Padua, Italy. And this was the scene that newly baptized would see as they came up out of the waters of baptism on Easter Sunday morning. Very, very powerful to have this sense of what it is we're baptized into, this unity of the entire body of Christ. At the Second Vatican Council, the Church Fathers reminded us of this letter from St. Cyprian from the early church, that liturgical services are not private functions, but celebration of the church, which is the sacrament of unity. And so this notion basically raises our unity to a sacramental level. And what about our liturgy? What about the instruction we get from the church in the general instruction of the Roman Missal? Well, in paragraph 46, it makes reference to the fact that the faithful come together as one when we gather for worship. And in paragraph 50, in our gathering, marked by the sign of the cross, the mystery of the church is made manifest. So this mystery of this body of Christ that gathers together to pray together in common prayer is made manifest in the gathering. And then lastly here, paragraph 294, the design of the church building should bring about a close and coherent unity that is clearly expressive of the unity of the entire holy people. So I think the direction is fairly consistent. So how do we respond? What sort of things do we talk about when we think of all of this scriptural and liturgical theological foundation? Well, we have to look at the area around the church building, an outdoor gathering space. We have to consider barrier-free design, which is natural for us these days. Our sensibilities have been raised so high in that regard. We talk about a single main entrance so we can bring people together as one. We look at the church doors as a significant moment in the procession in and out, and also the interior gathering space or narthex, and then even the placement of the baptismal font, which very much relates to our unity. So the area around the church building and built of living stones, the document from the American bishops from the year 2000, paragraph 98, says that the outside of the church building can proclaim the gospel to the city or town which is located, can proclaim this unity that we share. And so through creative landscaping, religious art, lighting, walkways with well-designed patterns and various materials, those are all things we can look at in the area around the church. And the goals that are listed in that paragraph include creating a gracious approach for public worship to the place of worship, to facilitate the spiritual transition as people move to a sense of communal worship. There's that sense of unity again. And then to contribute to the awareness that believers are about to enter holy ground. So why do I have a picture of the front of a Target store in the slide? I think it's just because I've noticed as Target has been renovating all their stores, they've really worked hard to kind of heighten this sense of approach and arrival and create these very inviting entrances and build anticipation to what's going to happen inside. Now you're still walking right out of a parking lot, and that's something we want to avoid at a worship facility. But I think we can learn something by looking around. So indoor or outdoor gathering rather, the coming and going of the faithful as they leave their cars and the parking lot and walk to and from the church. It's a transition space. It's important that it be close to the parking. It's important in some climates to have covered walkways that connect this space to the parking, particularly for people with disabilities. And I always like to remember that for some people, even with invisible disabilities, let's say emphysema or heart conditions, distance is a real barrier. So when we do talk about barrier-free design, we have to think about proximity of parking, especially for those with those kinds of disabilities. Of course, in the conversation around the area around the church, local climate considerations have to be taken into account. You know, some places there's more sun, some places more rain, there's heat, there's cold, there's humidity, and all those factors make a difference. When I worked in Sandpoint, Idaho, 60 miles from the Canadian border, there was still snow in the parking lot in March. And I'm sure it snowed after that too. But other places in the country, you know, the climate is much more forgiving a larger part of the year, although the sun can be hot and the humidity can be unbearable. So those all things weigh into the proportion of the exterior space and the interior space as well. So the outdoor gathering area presents an opportunity for all sorts of gardens, for seating, for a ritual center. At this project out in Hacienda Heights, California, we created a large open plaza in front of the doors on axis with the baptismal font and the altar table. And the architect wanted to put a big tree right in the middle, and I persuaded them that no, we need to leave the middle of the space open for rituals that may take place there. So these spaces are essentially ritual spaces and need to consider that. So things like the Rite of Acceptance here at my parish in Albuquerque, the procession with palms on Palm Sunday, the new fire at the Easter Vigil, you know, enough space for the entire assembly to come out, particularly in a climate where this is possible, to come out and surround the new fire at the Easter Vigil. It's a wonderful example of making a permanent setting for the new fire, if that can be done in a gathering space outside. Here's one that Mary Rose did way back in 2004 out in California, and I think it's just a wonderful example of a permanent setting for the new fire. Also, we can include seasonal color, you know, to kind of animate the space as people come and go, to remind them of the season. Some parishes, like St. John Fisher in Southern California, also we added a labyrinth and a columbarium to the outdoor places around the church. Exterior art is a wonderful opportunity to create little devotional settings, to kind of little nooks along the way, if you will, along the pathways in gardens. This one very skillfully located to invite you in, so that when you approach the statue, you couldn't see the face of Mary or Jesus. So you were invited to go in and sit down. That's a very, very skillful location of things. So opportunities for landscaping, shrine building, all of what we might think of for devotional shrines, even inside the church, we can transfer to the exterior in certain ways. So barrier-free design I've mentioned, and the American bishops have issued a statement, a pastoral statement on people with disabilities, and building and construction and renovation is addressed in this document. And they say in paragraph 22 that whenever parishes contemplate new construction, they should make provisions in their plans for the needs of individuals with disabilities. And of course, disabilities come in all shapes and sizes. As I mentioned, some are not even visible to us, but there are mobility disabilities, vision, hearing, developmental, and age-related disabilities, just simple things like balance and being able to see well with lighting, etc. And I think it's important, a lot of what I'm talking about here is in new construction, but it's also important to look at our buildings if you're involved with a renovation effort and ask the question, what do our buildings say? What do they say about welcome and inclusivity and hospitality? And on the image on the left there, I'm pretty sure somebody wasn't thinking when they put those two signs on the same post. And the image in the center, that is the small vestibule of a church, and right outside the doors are about 8 or 10 other steps that you have to climb, and you walk in and then you find 6 or 8 more. It's really not a very hospitable process of coming into the church. And then the image on the right, I think very often handicap ramps, as we call them, wheelchair ramps, have been placed around the back or onto a side door. And what does that say to someone who needs to use that ramp, particularly in a situation like a funeral or a wedding where a family member is using a wheelchair? So we just have to really look carefully at our buildings and what we're saying. Under the heading of unity and gathering as one, I think a single main entrance is very important to consider in new construction. Of course, you still have to have fire exits, but they wouldn't be used as entry points. Under the subheading of hospitality and welcome, this is an example of a gathering space to the right of in this image here, and a single main entrance off to the right off the plaza. But off to the left is a covered drop-off and a covering that allows people who need a little more time to get in and out of the car, maybe someone using a wheelchair, to get into the building, still into the gathering space, so that once they're inside, they still have the same experience as everybody else. The doors themselves are something to consider. I always recommend a center pair of doors that are wider and taller, processional doors. And in Built of Living Stones, it mentions that these have practical and symbolic significance. They're a secure, steady symbol of Christ, the Good Shepherd, and that gives the feeling to those who follow him that they're entering and being safe. Now, in older buildings, when we talk about interior gathering, very often we see these very small vestibules, and they're not really a place to hang out. And if you're working with this kind of a building, I think one of the things that can happen is to look inside those doors to the right and see if there are any opportunities of carving out space inside the worship space itself to house the function of gathering. I like to think of the indoor gathering space as primarily a liturgical space, because it's an area where processions begin and end, the rite of baptism begins, the wedding rite, the procession assembles there, the funeral rite begins in the gathering space at the doors, the rite of acceptance as part of the RCIA, and certainly the fellowship of the Holy Spirit that we experience as we gather and go forth. So it's really a liturgical space. And to respond to that idea, I think it's very important to look at extending the design field of the worship space itself into the narthex, into the gathering space, so that similar finishes, similar materials, structure, lighting, all of that sort of thing, similar attention to detail, so that it feels like a very special space. Here's an example of a renovation or an expansion where the historic nave of the church was converted into a gathering space. We chopped part of it off and then added the new nave beyond. But the new building actually picked up much of its character from the existing historic building. So again, the relationship between the two spaces is important. Once you're in that gathering space and want to move into the interior, again, the processional doors, the wider and taller set of doors, and you can see in comparison to the ones on the right and the left over there, how much larger those are in the center. Just a nice way of marking that procession. Seating areas are important to create around the gathering space. It's not just a big, wide hallway. And Jim is going to talk a little more about the idea of nooks and seating arrangements in a few minutes. It's a place for patronal shrines, images that remind the faithful as they gather and go forth of under whose patronage they are worshiping. It's a place for seasonal shrines. At my own parish here in Albuquerque, we actually have a dedicated area that we use on kind of a rotational basis. We set up the ofrenda for the month of November, and then the nativity scene is there in December, and it's used in other ways throughout the year. Information sharing is another subject, and Jim's going to talk a little more about this, but I just wanted to share this example. It's something we developed in a church in South Haven, Mississippi. We were talking about wanting to be able to minimize visual clutter. And so this was a way to close off the bulletin boards and the little cubbies if there was a wedding or a funeral. It just wanted to kind of keep things a little more clean looking. And then what about hospitality for parents with small children? And this cry room idea is a uniquely Catholic phenomenon. And if you look at this particular example here, kind of closed off little room, the window was relocated from a historic church, and I don't know why, but they picked the penance window to put in this room. I don't know what they were trying to say there. This is even worse, though, as an example of how to deal with noisy children, I think. And so what I would recommend is something that I call a parent's alcove. that basically is a wide spot in the gathering space. This at St. Vincent de Paul in Austin, we created a fairly large room that's actually used as a place for the viewing before the funeral liturgy, but also as a parent's alcove. It's a fairly good sized space, but it's got these benches and loudspeakers and a clear view into the nave. And here's another example on that church up in Sandpoint, Idaho, we did with actual pews in the gathering space for parents to use on a temporary basis. What about renovation of older churches? You know, so many older buildings are located at the corner, the main entrance right off the street, and all the parking kind of relegated to the back. And so people are kind of sneaking in the back door, and they don't really have the opportunity to have, you know, exposure to a gathering space and all of the facilities and aspects of that. And so here is an example at the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception in Wichita. We did sort of a linear gathering space that connected the parking, also the parish offices and the social hall and other offices, and then with a long linear hallway extended out to the front. So ritually, there could be a connection to the front end of the building, sort of the ritual front door of the building. And the gathering space was pulled away so it didn't impinge on the historic building. And then that brought a lot of natural light into the gathering space itself. And here's what it looks like, just sort of almost like a street with hospitality elements, information elements, access to the worship space, access to an outdoor garden, and then on one side, a history wall, a very nice way, and particularly for a diocese, to share the history of the diocese with people who visit the cathedral. Another aspect liturgically has to do with the order of Christian funerals. And in the order, there is a vigil for the deceased with reception at the church. And I'm seeing that this is happening more and more often. And this church in Omaha, Brother William Woger was the liturgical design consultant. They created a permanent setting over there to the right as a place to put the casket for the viewing for this vigil. And it's basically called a catafalque, and that's essentially the base upon which a casket rests. And with the growing use of cremation, this is also the place where an ossuary containing the urn with the ashes could be set for the viewing, sort of the vigil the night before the funeral liturgy itself. At St. Henry in Nashville, the day after the dedication, there was a funeral, and this gathering space worked very well as a place for people to gather and come and visit and share memories. And then the casket was actually placed in a transition area between the gathering space and the new church, right by the baptismal font. And this quote from Built of Living Stones highlights, I think, the appropriateness of this, where it says the baptismal font and its location reflect the Christian's journey through the waters of baptism to the altar. And so the font may be in this kind of transition place between the gathering space and the nave, or in some cases it can be placed directly in the gathering space. At St. John Vianney in Hacienda Heights, we did that mostly because of the climate, and so much gathering takes place outside. We were able to overlap these two functional areas. It becomes a very prominent symbol and part of the whole ritual of gathering and being reminded of our baptismal call. At St. Charles Borromeo in Kettering, Ohio, Father Richard Bosco was the consultant on this project, and it's actually the parish where I grew up. They have a gathering space baptismal font location, and so the assembly moves out around the font at the Easter Vigil, and I was there for an infant baptism on a Sunday once, and the same thing happened. They invited the assembly to come out and surround the family and the child for the celebration of baptism. Really very powerful experience. So lots of opportunities. And lastly, I just wanted to mention that part of the role of the gathering space, and Jim's going to talk a little more about this, is to connect people with other functions, other functional areas, other aspects of church life. And from a liturgical point of view, I like to highlight the fact that because the processions begin and end in the gathering space, this is the place to locate a sacristy space for the various liturgical ministers that are coming in and signing in and, you know, getting last minute instructions, coordinating with the presider, and then a vesting sacristy for the priest and deacon. And I like to suggest that it be sort of one step removed from the gathering space, just to give a little privacy and quiet time for those presiding at liturgy. The work sacristy, then, to care for the vessels and linens and flowers and things in the sanctuary, that happens at the other end of the building. And so just different functional areas. So with that, I will turn this over to Jim Hundt.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ken. So I'm going to talk about some of the other things that happen in the gathering space. There are a lot of things that happen there that are non-liturgical, and there's 5 design factors that we're going to talk about. The first impressions, it's a place for connections and ministry outreach, and then finally about orientation and wayfinding, which are important elements of the gathering space. So the first impressions, this is important because when we think about particularly visitors to the church and unchurched people who are looking for a church home, that they're going to have an impression about whether this is a potential church home for them within the first few minutes. So what you want to be able to convey to those folks is, what is your church's message and what's your story? Your gathering space will convey to them what style of church you are in terms of how formal or informal you are. There'll be signs about who goes here, whether you're welcoming children, families with children, or elderly people or disabled people. So it's very important to look at existing gathering spaces and to design new gathering spaces with all these questions in mind, because this is really your best opportunity to attract newcomers to your church, which is part of our evangelization. So I'm just going to show you 3 or 4 gathering spaces without comment, so you can see the differences in design style, and you can have your first impressions of these spaces. Now, of course, some of them have people and some of them don't, which obviously makes a difference, but there are also different styles as well. So it's something that's very important design consideration. The other first impression is how people feel, not just what they see. So it's important to have good temperature control, have things like vestibules and so on to keep in the northeast cold air from blowing in the winter. A bright space is always desirable because we are bringing Christ's light to the world, and if our gathering space is dark, that's not going to be consistent with that message. And in what ways is it inviting? Is it too quiet or too noisy? And noisy tends to be the bigger problem when it's designed without thinking about the acoustical qualities. And I'm sure many of you have been in spaces where the noise level is so loud it's impossible to really carry on a conversation. So it's important to design that space to encourage conversation. You can see in this example, a lot of windows bring in a lot of light into the space in the morning after masses, and the ceilings are treated with acoustical materials, and as there's carpet on the floor, this obviously is a space that is relatively quiet even when there are a lot of people in it. Even if you have hard flooring, you can use acoustical material on the ceiling to reduce the noise, and of course the people in the space will reduce it somewhat. But again, brightness, bringing this light is brought in from all 4 sides of the space, so it keeps the space very bright. In this more contemporary example, you see again off in the left side, lots of fenestration, flooding this space with light, supplemented by electric lighting, and a lot of openness and the materials that convey a certain feel to the space. So if you look, you'll see various things that kind of tell you the idea, the style of this church. Other things that people would be concerned about when they come into the worship space is what they can expect beyond the doors to the worship space. And again, I'm speaking mostly of those who are seeking a new church home. It's hard enough to get through the door to the gathering space. They still have to get through the door to the worship space. So they might be looking for cues about whether they feel comfortable making that next step. Can I see what's going on in there? Does it look, there's sometimes a lot of mystery for people who don't go to church or haven't been to church in a long time, and they want to see if things are the way they'll be comfortable. If you're in a wheelchair, can you see from the entrance that there'll be a place for you to park that won't be in the middle of an aisle? So when you look in and you see a church with a 5-foot aisle and no designated seating for wheelchairs, that's going to put off people in wheelchairs because they're going to think, I have to sit in the middle of the aisle, or I have to sit in front of the first row or behind the back row. So we usually include a couple of designated spaces near the back as well as other ones near the front, so that at least people can see that there are spaces available to them. If their disability is hearing impairment, it should be clear to them that there are aids for that, so which could be assistive listening devices that are easily available near the main entrance, or it could be large print worship aids or hymnals. So these things should not require someone to go find an usher to go find out if they have these things. They should be readily available to offer to people who need them. And then there are people who got as far as the gathering space but are not really sure they want to go in for worship because maybe they're not ready for that. So there are people who will want to basically watch the service from out in the gathering space, or they may worry about whether their children are too noisy and they think, let me just stay out here for now and see what's going on. So they may be looking to see if there are TV monitors around that are going to be live streaming the video of the church out into the gathering space. And I suspect that after this pandemic, every church will have live streaming capabilities. So this is something to basically address in your gathering space as well. It also serves the purpose, as Ken was talking before, about families who want to, step out of the worship space. Although one option is, as Ken presented, where they have direct view into the worship space. Another option is spaces where they have video feeds of the worship experience. So if we look at a couple of examples in this space, the doors to the right are the doors into the worship space, and you can see that they have relatively small windows. They don't tell you much about what's going on the other side. Ideally, these doors would all be open before worship, but if they're not, then it's very mysterious about what you're going to find on the other side. So it's not usually the recommendation to do something like that. By comparison, this church, which shows all the pairs of doors open at this point, and you can see that the doors are completely glass. So as you enter the space, you can look over to your right and see the worship space. And if you look back from the worship space out to the gathering space, you can see the series of 3 pairs of doors, and then there's also glazing in between the doors. So there's not a lot of solid wall there, and it basically gives people an option to look in and see, yes, there is in fact a handicap ramp. There are other things that they can tell by looking inside. They can basically see the entire worship space from the gathering space, and that's a plus. This congregation decided they wanted as much transparency between those two spaces as possible. So they have a series, there's a pair of doors that's open in the center, but next to that are a series of single hung windows that can be opened so that sound goes right through the space, and it allows, they use that space as overflow and allows the people in the overflow to feel more part of the congregation. And they had those windows open for the dedication because they needed it because of overflow. And they've since found out that they like that transparency and fluidity between the two spaces, so they have yet to close the windows. The second most important design key for gathering spaces is about connections. As it says here, the gathering space is the ideal place for creating relational space for a congregation. This is where we want people to congregate and connect with each other. We do the exchange of peace in the church, but that's not, well, we used to. That's not the kind of relational experience that we necessarily want. And this is a space that's mission critical for churches in order to as Ken talked about, building unity in the church. That's what we do in a practical sense in the gathering space. So a good gathering space design should increase the time people spend together at church. That's an important thing to remember. You're probably all familiar with the term proxemics and the zones for connection from Edward Hall's work in 1963. So you know that we have different zones around us that are comfortable or uncomfortable having people in them. So we want to have a large enough gathering space so that people are not forced into each other's personal or intimate zone when they don't want to be, because that makes people want to leave if they can't get the distance they want to be comfortable. Interestingly, this diagram shows social distancing as 4 to 12 feet. We now know that's 6 feet. But the whole idea is we need to have those kinds of spaces for people to feel comfortable and to be able to stay and make connections with other people. So we're going to talk about a couple of different ways that those connections can be made. The two primary ways that they're done is they call the 5 and 50, which relates to a 5-minute connection and a 50-minute connection. Now, maybe in your church right now, nobody stays there for 50 minutes, but that is done in a lot of churches, particularly when there's other activities going on Sunday morning. So we have to provide for both of those types of connections in the gathering space, and we do that through clusters, nooks, edges, hotspots, and perches. And this whole gathering space, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term third place spaces, but third place spaces was a concept pretty much originated by Starbucks to create a place that's not work and that's not home, that people are comfortable hanging out at. And more churches are trying to make their gathering spaces become third place spaces so that people will think of going there on days other than the weekends when they have services. Because if you design it properly, people can use those as places where they can meet up with friends, maybe get a cup of coffee or a drink or a beverage. So that's a possibility to consider. So let's look at the different ways that we do that. A cluster is no more than a grouping of furniture in a wide open space. So you take a look at this space and you can see that without any furniture, it would look very unusable. So they put some groupings of chairs with little occasional tables and some chairs with dining tables. And these allow people to break off into great groups of 2 or 3. But as you can see, they're kind of just all open to each other. So in a sense, this invites other people to join your cluster, which can be a good thing. And same thing if you have with even dining tables set up, it's the same idea that people are clustered around these tables. Other people may just ask if they can join your conversation and do so. So that accomplishes one thing. Whereas nooks are a little different concept. Nooks are places you may want to go in order to have a little bit more privacy or, to have a longer, more intimate relationship. So that is another type of space that should be included. Edges are places where people who are not quite ready to get involved with the connections can sort of stand on the edges or sit on the edges and kind of watch what's going on until either someone invites them to participate or they see somebody that they'd like to talk to. And that's another important space, because some people, if you don't provide spaces like that, some people will just get uncomfortable and they'll leave because they don't want to stand in the middle of the room all alone. So edges are an important feature. Now, what most Catholic gathering spaces have are what we would call hotspots, which are basically spaces, 5-minute spaces where you can just talk with somebody for 5 minutes. And for a hotspot, you really don't need anything except floor space for people to talk to each other. Most Catholic gathering spaces have little to no furniture, as this one does, so they only provide the opportunity for those 5-minute conversations. Whereas something like what we call perches are spaces like with tables or benches where people can sort of be, again, sort of off to the side, but watching what's going on, and they might stay there a lot longer. So even if it was a single person, they might be sitting at a table reading a book, reading their Bible. They might be talking with somebody else, but these are places where people feel comfortable for longer conversations. So you can see the ideal gathering space includes both. It's also a great space for ministry outreach, which is essentially a call to action. After we've been talking about what it means to be a Christian, how do you put that into action? So this particular church has a food pantry in their gathering space, which clearly invites people to donate, but also is a place of ministry for people to use. So that's one type of way to do it. If you have small groups or mission groups or sign-ups for other things that allow people to practice their faith, you can have a place where those opportunities are available. So there are a lot of ways to do this, but it's good to have a designated space where you are focused on that sort of call to action or encounter space that we sometimes call it. I'll just go briefly through orientation. That's another important function of the gathering space, because as people come in, they kind of need to know where to go and what to do. I mean, sometimes it's obvious, but if it's, you know, how to get to the worship space, but it isn't always obvious. So, or they may have other needs that are despite in not just going into the worship space. They may need to know about childcare or something else. So a welcome desk or counter can provide that. Visitors to the church from out of town who may be coming for a wedding or funeral will probably be looking for restrooms before anything else. So it's important for those to be easily accessible and visible. And then if you have more than one worship space, it's important to be able to find your way to the various spaces and to know where they are. So it might be a chapel, it might be a youth ministry space. So all these things are important in the orientation. And welcome desks can be as simple as a desk off to the side that looks kind of like a reception desk. They can be more contemporary types of counter areas where there's room for a number of volunteers to help out so that people don't have to wait in line to ask the questions that they have. It can be combined with a bookstore, as it's done in this example. Or it can be sort of a central pivoting point of your whole gathering space where all sorts of things take place, where literature is distributed, people can ask questions, kids can sign in for their Sunday school classes and so on. So there are a lot of different ways to do it. It's just important that it's visible and accessible. And finally, on wayfinding, these are pretty much standard requirements for wayfinding. These are taken from official.us's blog, The Importance of Wayfinding and Signage at Your Church, which you might want to follow up on. And the one I want to point out is about being consistent with your branding. If your church does use certain typefaces or colors or logos for all of its promotional material, if you will, the signage should reflect that as well. This is what we were talking about briefly about restrooms. This is one way to make them very easy to find. Not everybody's solution, but it's an option. And then a couple of examples of signage that's designed for the space. This particular one for a Methodist church, they used this of course, the symbol for Methodist church, but they also had this as part of their architecture. So they decided to incorporate it into their signage and into all of the signage for the rooms. And the one thing I want to mention about this is that they were very careful in their word choice. They didn't use the word sanctuary, which is normally used for the worship space for a Methodist church, because they didn't want people who didn't know what a sanctuary was to be confused. So they just used worship, because that's what the space is for. So you can, you're encouraged to use more accessible terms rather than terms that maybe only people in your congregation would know. On the final example of just putting it all together, you can see this. This is, of course, a very large gathering space, but it has all the components. If we zoom in a little bit, you'll see that there are, obviously cluster areas where people can sit. I think there's some nooks that are a little bit hard to see in here, but over to the right is a kind of mission space. You have your welcome desk right in the center. So, and signage actually on the walls that can be seen from a distance, so you can know which way to go to the various sanctuaries. So it all has to be done in a very cohesive way that really makes a great first impression. So a lot of the images and the information that I've presented today came from the Aspen Group, which is a design firm in Indiana. It does a lot of excellent work, and they have created a booklet called Creating Third Place Spaces at Church, which is available as a handout at this webinar. So if in your control panel, there's one that says handouts. If you click on that, you'll be able to download this PDF and see and hear about, read about a lot of things I spoke about. So with that, I think we are ready for questions and answers, right, Paul?
And yes, if you'd like to ask questions, you can use the question tab in the control panel, or you can raise your hand. I do have one thing I'm going to start out with. Ken, you talked about, you showed a lovely example of a huge courtyard outside a church, and I know whenever I work with churches that either have that or we're proposing that, distance becomes a concern for people. I do think there's some benefit, and I see this with school design as well, of being able to see trouble coming from farther away when there is a large distance between where maybe parking is and the front doors. And so for safety reasons, we have to think about this a little bit more at churches, and being able to see a potential threat coming is often helpful. Are there other factors that you're seeing in church design with gathering spaces that specifically address safety and security concerns?
Boy, that's a whole other subject where we could do another webinar on that. But definitely, I think even in my own parish, we've had a security expert come and do kind of a seminar for all the ushers and parish staff and some others involved with liturgy, just to kind of think about how to monitor what's going on and what to do and what the procedures are. And a lot of it has to do with the location of entrances and exits. And I think it's a whole other skill set that churches are having to develop in this day and age, and now we've layered on top of that the whole social distancing factor. So there's a lot of very complex things to consider in the design of these spaces, but security and observation, I think, that it's easy to kind of see where people are coming from and where they're going. That's an important design feature these days. So Gilbert Singera made a comment saying, great presentation with great images. And he notes that he struggles with large gathering spaces in some churches that are typically empty when they arrive. Are you finding strategies where entry and exit are actually different paths? I have found in my own observations and work in this area that once you've established the connection between parking and outdoor gathering space, indoor gathering space, baptismal font, and then seating arrangement, it kind of works in both directions. And you don't want to miss the font on the way back out. And as Jim highlighted for us, the opportunities for the 5-minute and the 50-minute encounters after worship is something that I think is still also on that path. And from a Catholic standpoint, with Catholic liturgy and the importance of procession, I think of things like, what happens during the funeral rite. The procession goes all the way in and then it comes all the way back out. Same thing with a wedding. People start outside and they go in, and then there's the big procession back out. And so I think of that processional aspect as kind of a pretty important factor to accommodate. Now, that doesn't mean you can't come out into a gathering space and have multiple ways to exit out into access parking and other parts of the site too. Garden areas that are adjacent or whatever. I could see other opportunities, but I think of it primarily as a processional experience.
It's kind of interesting related to that, Ken. When you talk about where the church gathers, I often think about we also have to think about how the church sends. And so we don't only call, we also send forth. And the gathering place is the place where we also send people back out to do the work of the church in the world.
I usually talk about the gathering space as both the gathering space and the going forth space. We're reminded of our baptism on the way in as we gather as one, and then we're also reminded of our baptismal call on the way out. So yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Well, relative to Gilbert's question, I think what I'm envisioning and what he's asking is that you have a large space that you have to traverse to get from the main entrance into the worship space entrance. And usually going into church, there are no social functions going on. So people are just kind of passing through and it is mostly empty. One of the alternatives to that is to not have the entire space in between the two doors. So that you might want to shorten the distance between the doors and then have the gathering space perhaps wider, and could even go to the point where there may be only one way that people go into church, but maybe they come out in other ways, but they all from other doorways, but they all end up in the same gathering space. And that can help I don't like that look that it's like I'm walking through a fellowship hall to get to church. That's not the experience we want people to have. So that's a design challenge to see how to avoid that.
So Pam Hardiman is asking, Ken, she says, I love the tall doors in the center, both from the outside of the gathering space and the gathering space to the worship space. So often if you are using banners, you have to duck to get in the door. So much grateful having a tall door to go through.
Yeah, the processional cross and the banners can don't have to do that liturgical dip to get through. That's good. Good observation, Pam.
And then another follow-up from Gilbert asking, have you found some ideas to help people shift to more silence as they transition from the gathering to the worship space?
You got anything on that, Ken?
Well, I can make a comment on that. Some of my clients, the parishes I've worked with, have actually felt very strongly about having a lot of quiet in the worship space before the liturgy begins. And what we've usually ended up talking about is having a very active gathering space right inside the front doors, where all of the kind of functions and things that Jim has illuminated for us. But then there's a transition space that's kind of oftentimes, a couple times we've done even with doors between the narthex and this transition space, and then the transition space and the actual nave of the church. It's a lower ceiling, different acoustical environment, and it does give this sense of transition. I showed a couple of examples of transition spaces, and that's the kind of device that I found helps with that when that is the concern of actually, bringing people through that experience of preparing for the worship in a quieter way.
Mm-hmm. And as much as I respect what you were saying about being a liturgical space and having something in common with the worship space, there's also an architectural advantage from there being a different character, because that indicates a different behavior. So if it doesn't feel like, if the rooms do have a different character, that can also encourage different behavior.
Right. And Jim, your idea of extending the gathering space out so that it's not just the space between the doors and the nave of the church, that part of it there, the more processional part of it would be the area where I would think first about making it that kind of liturgical to relate to the processional aspect, but all those other functions can spill out in other ways, different height ceilings, different character. That's a very good point. Thanks.
I'm going to ask this of you, Jim. It's not really a question, maybe it's just a point for conversation, but I also, as many of us are often visitors to churches that we're unaware of, some of which are very welcoming, some of which are not so. And when you talk about places for visitors to kind of acclimate, I have found art and environment to be really helpful. A fireplace or a coffee counter, someplace that as a visitor before I feel like I belong, or if nobody is particularly hospitable coming up and talking to me, I've got something to do, so I'm not just awkwardly standing in the middle of space.
Well, that's one of the actually really good functions of this. When we talked about the outreach, and I often call these encounter spaces because it gives you a chance to encounter Christ outside the church. I'm often drawn to that space if there is such a space when I come into the church, because remember I talked about how you want to tell the church's story and what's important to the church. To me, that's the one thing that does, well, not the one thing, but it's a very important part. So if I see that type of a space, I will go over there and see how this church is actually being Christ in the world. And that will make a huge impression on me if I see, oh, well, they're doing this feeding program and they've got this program going on and they've got these groups happening. That will make the church appealing to me. And I think that also answers your question. It's like, okay, I've got my cup of coffee. I don't know anybody here. What am I going to do? I'll go over and I'll read that. And oftentimes, because I'm reading that, someone who's involved in that ministry will come over to me and they'll say, you know, do you want to know more about this program or any of these programs? You know, is this something you're interested in? So I do think it's important. And I think you also talked about other things, and Ken showed this memory wall. I mean, places that people can interact with architecturally on their own, I think are also helpful because it gives them a chance to transition. So those are kind of like the edges that I was talking about. You can imagine somebody standing at that memory wall reading while they're getting comfortable, and maybe somebody comes up and stands next to them and starts talking to them. So I think that's a very good point, Paul, that we have to make sure that it's not just like walking into a fellowship hall and if you don't have a table to sit at, you're you know, left out in the cold.
Well, the volume, I was very pleased that a lot of your images showed volumes that have variety.
Right.
So that, you know, if you are alone, if you are on your own, to some extent, you don't have to be standing in a space where you are swimming in a big volume and feel even more awkward. The periphery of the space or a smaller space of an alcove, you know, just gives you a little more cover to be able to feel like you're not exposed.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very much.
I also appreciated the insider when you were talking about naming spaces or insider language of spaces. I have worked in some settings where people will say, yeah, go to the Melanchthon room. And number one, it's, you know, it is a cumbersome name that takes a little while to figure out if you don't know Lutheran heritage. And in addition to that, I have no idea where the Melanchthon room is, right? So, you know, yeah, exactly. Giving people those cues is a part of hospitality. And I understand we have pride in our history and we have pride in our symbolism. But I think balancing insider language so it draws people into the history of that particular parish or that particular denomination, but doesn't kind of assault them with unknown things that just make them feel like they're the outsider, paving treacherous ground.
Well said, Paul. Well said.
So one more comment, I think, from Marilyn, and this kind of goes back to the silence. Just made a mention, go back to being quiet in church. Do we really have to be quiet in the worship space? Larger discussion, I'm sure, with a variety of different potential directions for exploration.
Yeah.
And I think that is about all the time that we have. Thank you so much for both of your presentations and tackling this from very different perspectives, but with overlapping issues and concerns. Ken and Jim, thanks so much again for your expertise and your willingness to do this webinar, and we'll look forward to continued engagement with the both of you as ACLS continues on into the future.
All right, and thank you all the participants for being here today.
Yeah, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Okay. Bye-bye.